Japanese Naval Force, Pacific Theater, October 1944. In the last dark hour before dawn, the fleet moved through the Pacific as if the night belonged to it. Engines ran at controlled speed, pushing long, narrow holes across calm water that reflected nothing but darkness. There was no moon above, no visible horizon ahead, only layered blackness where sea and sky merged into a single surface. Distance felt abstract. Direction felt assumed rather than seen. This was a Japanese naval force in transit, not in battle. Ships held close formation, deliberately tight, the spacing chosen for coordination rather than defense. Each vessel knew its place. Each captain trusted that if combat came, it would unfold in a familiar sequence: warning first, reaction second, engagement last. On deck, nothing felt urgent. Lookouts scanned the water with patient, practiced movements. Officers spoke quietly, conserving attention rather than raising it. Guns were manned, but idle. Fire control teams waited for confirmation that had not yet appeared. The expectation was simple. If the enemy was near, there would be a sign. Japanese naval doctrine had been shaped by that belief. Even surprise carried a rhythm, a flash in the distance, a shell falling short, a moment, sometimes only seconds, to identify direction and bring weapons to bear. That moment never came. What the men on deck could not see was that the battle had already begun far beyond human senses. Somewhere in the darkness, positions were fixed, courses plotted, firing solutions completed. Decisions had already been made without a single flare, without a single sound. Inside the Japanese ships, nothing yet reflected that reality. No alarms, no shouted commands, no visible enemy. Then the night collapsed. The first shells struck almost simultaneously, ripping through multiple ships in rapid succession. There was no build-up, no warning thunder. Steel tore open. Fire burst outward where darkness had existed seconds before. The sea flashed bright and then vanished again beneath smoke and spray. The shock was immediate and disorienting. Men reacted to impact before understanding there was an enemy at all. Orders were shouted, then drowned out by noise. Officers demanded bearings that could not be confirmed. Smoke spread quickly, turning the tight formation into a maze of fire and shadow. Ships were being hit faster than the mind could process cause and effect. And still, no counterfire followed. Not because crews hesitated. Not because courage failed. But because the battle refused to present itself in a form that could be answered. Targets could not be seen. Fire control systems struggled to lock on. Command fought to orient in a fight that had already moved past the opening phase. By the time some guns began to swing, neighboring ships were already burning beyond recovery. 14 minutes. That was all it would take. 19 ships would be lost, many before firing a single coordinated shot in return. The engagement would be remembered not for an exchange of fire, but for its absence. Because the defining feature of this battle was not destruction. It was how completely reaction had been denied. And by the time the fleet understood that, the night had already decided everything. The formation was not an accident. Japanese naval doctrine had long favored concentration. Ships were expected to operate close enough to function as a single body, sharing information, overlapping defenses, and responding together once contact was made. Tight spacing was not considered risky. It was considered disciplined. In theory, it offered protection. Anti-aircraft fire could overlap. Lookouts could support one another. Signals could be passed quickly from ship to ship. Command assumed that cohesion reduced confusion, especially at night, when distance distorted judgment and isolation magnified fear. This belief shaped how the fleet moved. Rather than spreading out to absorb surprise, ships stayed close to preserve control. Commanders trusted that if the enemy appeared, centralized orders would arrive immediately. The formation was designed for reaction speed after contact, not survival before it. That distinction mattered. The doctrine assumed that the first moments of engagement would be survivable. A fleet might take hits, but it would have time to respond. Tight formation was meant to ensure that response was unified rather than fragmented. It also reflected confidence. By 1944, Japanese crews were experienced at sea. Night operations were not unfamiliar. Many officers believed that discipline and coordination could offset technological disadvantages. What mattered most was not seeing first, but reacting together once battle revealed itself. That confidence produced habits. Courses were held steady to avoid confusion. Spacing was maintained to prevent accidental separation. Independent maneuvering was discouraged unless ordered. Ships trusted the system more than individual initiative. The formation looked strong. From within it, proximity felt reassuring. Neighboring hulls were visible shapes in the darkness. Engine sounds blended into a single presence. The fleet felt unified, connected by routine and expectation. What was less considered was how that same proximity could become a liability. Tight spacing reduced reaction margin. A ship struck suddenly had little room to maneuver without affecting others. Smoke and fire spread quickly from one vessel to the next. Shockwaves carried farther. Damage in one place created disruption everywhere. The formation also assumed intact command. Orders were expected to flow outward instantly. Fire control coordination depended on shared timing. If command functioned, the fleet could turn concentration into strength. If it did not, the same concentration could amplify chaos. That risk was acknowledged but minimized. Doctrine rarely plans for the immediate loss of control. It plans for stress, not decapitation. The formation was built to respond to battle, not to absorb it without warning. On this night, that assumption would be tested brutally. The fleet moved as it had been taught to move, close, orderly, confident that reaction would follow contact. Ships trusted that the system surrounding them would hold long enough to matter. They did not know that the opening moments would leave no space for adjustment. No time to spread out. No time to coordinate. No time to transform formation into defense. What had been designed as strength would soon compress damage instead of resisting it. The formation was tight because doctrine said it should be. The disaster would come from how little room that doctrine left for the unexpected. The imbalance that decided the engagement was not visible on the surface of the sea. It existed in time. By 1944, naval combat had crossed a quiet threshold. Detection no longer depended on eyesight or sound. It depended on data, signals moving faster than human perception could follow. Once a fleet was detected, the battle did not begin gradually. It began already optimized. Radar removed uncertainty. Contacts appeared not as vague hints, but as confirmed positions. Range and bearing stabilized within moments. Movement patterns emerged quickly. Fire control systems did not wait for visual confirmation. They calculated where targets would be, not where they were. This changed everything. In earlier naval battles, the opening phase belonged to hesitation. Fleets searched, guessed, adjusted. Even surprise contained a margin, a brief pause where commanders oriented themselves before acting. That pause had always been part of survival. Radar erased it. For the attacking force, detection and engagement merged into a single action. The moment contact existed, firing solutions followed. There was no probing phase, no exchange of ranging shots. The first shells were already aimed with intent. For the Japanese fleet, this shift was invisible. Doctrine still assumed sequence. Warning would precede damage. Time would exist between contact and catastrophe. Even if surprised, crews expected seconds, sometimes only seconds, but enough to react. Those seconds never existed. The engagement did not unfold at human speed. It unfolded at system speed. Decisions were made faster than orders could be spoken. The opening salvos were not reactions. They were executions of calculations completed before the Japanese fleet knew it had been detected. This is why the first impacts felt unreal. There had been no escalation, no sense of transition from movement to battle. One moment the fleet was intact, waiting for confirmation. The next, ships were burning. The space between those moments had been erased by technology. The attacking force did not outshoot the Japanese fleet. It outpaced it. Speed in this battle did not mean maneuvering faster through water. It meant removing the opponent's opportunity to respond. By the time shells struck, the moment where reaction mattered had already passed. Fire control crews aboard the Japanese ships were not slow. They were simply late to a battle that had already moved beyond them. Radar had transformed combat into something asymmetrical. One side operated inside a loop of detection, decision, and action. The other waited for a loop that never closed. This difference did not show on the surface of the sea. It revealed itself only through effect. Multiple ships struck almost simultaneously, fires spreading before commands could be issued, systems failing before they could be used. The battle skipped the phase where awareness could translate into action. By the time the Japanese fleet understood that it was under attack, it was already too late to matter. The opening had been removed. And without an opening, there was no entry into the fight, only impact. What followed would not be shaped by tactics or bravery. It would be shaped by how completely the first moments had been denied. The first shells did not feel like the beginning of a battle. They felt like an interruption of reality. There was no distant thunder to announce them, no bright flash on the horizon to give direction, no gradual tightening of nerves as sound and sight aligned. The night offered no transition from anticipation to combat. It simply broke. Multiple ships were struck almost at once. The timing mattered. These were not isolated hits that allowed crews to orient and respond. Impacts overlapped, collapsing any sense of sequence. Fire erupted in several places simultaneously, turning sections of the formation into sudden sources of light before smoke swallowed everything again. For the men on deck, cause and effect blurred together. They felt the shock before they understood what had caused it. Steel buckled, compartments collapsed, flames climbed where darkness had been seconds earlier, orders were shouted, but direction could not be confirmed. The enemy had not revealed itself, only its results. This was the most paralyzing aspect of the opening. Japanese crews had trained for surprise, but surprise usually arrived with information. A bearing, a flash, a sound to orient toward. Here there was nothing to point at. The battle did not present a face. Smoke spread rapidly, thick and disorienting. The tight formation that had promised coordination now worked against the fleet. Burning ships illuminated their neighbors, then hid them again behind drifting clouds. The sea became a maze of shadow and fire with no stable reference points. Fire control crews struggled immediately. Range and direction could not be confirmed visually. Systems designed to refine aim found nothing to lock onto. Guns were ready, but readiness meant little without a target. The opening seconds that should have belonged to response were consumed by disorientation. Commanders attempted to impose order. Requests for bearings were made, reports were demanded, but information arrived fragmented and contradictory. Some ships reported hits from one direction, others from another. In reality, the attack was coordinated, but it did not feel that way from inside it. This confusion was not panic. It was overload. The opening salvos arrived with such speed and precision that they denied the fleet the basic step of understanding where it was being attacked from. Without that understanding, response could not form. And critically, the salvos did not pause. There was no gap between the first impacts and the next wave. No moment where crews could regain balance, clear smoke, or bring guns to bear. The pressure remained constant, forcing the fleet to absorb damage faster than it could process it. This is why the absence of counterfire was not a decision. It was a consequence. By the time some guns began to move, neighboring ships were already burning beyond recovery. Fire control systems were failing before they could stabilize. The formation was unraveling before it could react. The opening salvos did not win the battle outright, but they removed the only thing that could have stopped what followed. They took away the fleet's chance to enter the fight on its own terms. And once that chance was gone, everything that happened afterward unfolded without resistance, not because resistance was impossible, but because it was never allowed to begin. The silence that followed the opening salvos was not hesitation. It was disruption. From the outside, the absence of return fire looked inexplicable. A fleet under attack normally answers instinctively, guns turning, shells flying back toward the threat. Here, that reflex never took hold. The reasons were layered, compounding, and devastating. The first layer was damage. The opening hits did not strike randomly. They landed where reaction lived: fire control stations, bridges, communication lines, and power systems. Even ships that remained afloat found their ability to fight stripped away in seconds. Rangefinders were shattered. Control cables were severed. Power fluctuations knocked out systems that required stability to function. A gun without fire control is noise, not defense. Crews could load and elevate weapons, but they could not aim meaningfully. Bearings were guesses. Range was unknown. Firing blindly risked hitting friendly ships packed tightly alongside. In a dense formation, restraint was not caution, it was survival. The second layer was perception. Smoke and fire erased orientation. Burning ships illuminated the sea unevenly, creating false reference points that shifted constantly. The enemy remained invisible. Without a clear direction of attack, there was no safe arc of fire. Every decision felt wrong the moment it was considered. Officers demanded information their ships could not provide. Where is the enemy? Which bearing? How far? There were no answers that could be trusted. The third layer was command. Orders were being formed, but not completed. Messages were interrupted by explosions. Bridges lost officers mid-sentence. Even when commands were issued locally, they conflicted with what neighboring ships were doing. Coordination collapsed faster than authority could adapt. The tight formation made this worse. A ship that attempted to fire risked endangering others, maneuvering unpredictably nearby. Without centralized direction, restraint replaced aggression. Guns stayed silent not from fear, but from the impossibility of safe employment. This created a cruel feedback loop. No counterfire meant the enemy could continue switching targets freely. Continued hits created more damage, more smoke, more confusion, further reducing the chance of response. Each passing minute made the silence more permanent. It is important to understand what this silence was not. It was not shock alone. It was not cowardice. It was not indecision. It was a fleet being stripped of the conditions required to fight back. By the time some ships managed to fire isolated salvos, the moment for collective defense had already passed. Individual shots changed nothing. The engagement was being decided faster than response could organize. This is why history remembers this battle as one without counterfire. Not because Japanese ships chose not to shoot, but because the opening blows removed their ability to do so before choice even existed. The fleet did not lose a gunnery duel. It lost the chance to participate in one. What followed was not sustained pressure on a single ship. It was rotation. As soon as a vessel was hit and began to burn, the attacking force shifted focus. Guns did not linger to confirm a kill. They moved immediately to the next intact target. Fires were left to grow on their own, trusted to finish what the shells had started. This was deliberate. Damage control takes time. Reaction takes time. By switching targets faster than crews could respond, the attackers overloaded the fleet's capacity to recover. Ships were struck once or twice, then abandoned while still functional, only to be struck again minutes later when fires had spread and systems had degraded. The effect was cumulative. Every new hit created another crisis, demanding attention. Damage control teams were stretched thin. Officers were forced to choose which emergency to address first. Each choice left something else unattended. The tight formation amplified this pressure. Smoke from one burning ship rolled across its neighbors. Flames illuminated hulls that had not yet been hit, making them easier to identify. Shockwaves carried through steel, loosening fittings and disabling systems on ships that had not been directly struck. Target switching turned the formation into a conveyor belt of damage. No ship was allowed to stabilize. No crew was given space to recover. Before any vessel could regain control, attention shifted away, then returned when conditions were worse. This method did not rely on overwhelming force. It relied on tempo. The attackers dictated rhythm. The Japanese fleet reacted to consequences rather than actions. Every minute increased the number of ships burning simultaneously until the problem was no longer combat, it was containment. By the time some ships attempted to break formation or withdraw, the pattern was already established. New targets were available faster than old ones could be finished. The destruction felt mechanical, not chaotic, not emotional, methodical. And once the tempo was set, it never slowed. The 19 ships did not all meet the same end. Some were destroyed quickly. Direct hits ignited fires that reached ammunition spaces or disabled propulsion beyond recovery. These ships transitioned from operational to sinking in minutes, leaving crews little chance to respond. Others lasted longer. Fires spread slowly across decks and into internal compartments. Power failed incrementally, steering degraded. These ships remained afloat long enough for crews to understand that survival, not combat, had become the priority. Several were lost through secondary effects. In smoke-filled darkness, ships maneuvered blindly. Course changes intended to avoid fire placed vessels directly in each other's paths. Collisions tore open hulls already weakened by damage, sealing fates without another enemy shell landing. Some ships simply disappeared. They drifted away from the formation, burning or crippled, and were never seen again. No distress calls were received. No final moments were witnessed. Their absence was discovered later through numbers that no longer added up. There was no single instant when 19 losses became obvious. Destruction unfolded unevenly, some ships gone quickly, others fading out of the battle over time. The fleet was dismantled rather than erased. What connected every loss was isolation. Once coordination collapsed, each ship faced its own ending. For many crews, the battle ended without ever feeling like a fight. Guns remained loaded but unfired. Orders were half-spoken and never completed. Men moved instinctively, fighting fires, carrying wounded, sealing compartments, without ever engaging an enemy they could identify. This absence was disorienting. Training prepares sailors for action. It does not prepare them for paralysis created by uncertainty. Without targets, without bearings, without confirmation, action felt dangerous rather than decisive. Morale did not collapse. Understanding did. Crews did not know how many ships were still fighting, which directions were safe, or whether withdrawal had been ordered. Each ship existed inside its own emergency, disconnected from the larger picture. Eventually, realization arrived quietly. No new orders were coming. No coordinated response was forming. At that point, priorities shifted. Survival replaced mission. Lifeboats were readied. Sensitive equipment was destroyed. Wounded were moved wherever space allowed. These decisions were made independently at different times based on different signs. Some crews reached this understanding early, others only when the deck tilted beyond correction. The fleet did not fail its sailors. It vanished around them. Understanding came after the fact. Survivor accounts were fragmented, timelines conflicted, descriptions overlapped without aligning. There was no clear moment that defined the engagement's start or end, only a rapid descent into loss. Command struggled to reconstruct what had happened. There was no traditional battle report, no sequence of maneuvers, no exchange of fire to analyze. Casualties appeared without a corresponding engagement narrative. The realization was unsettling. The fleet had not lost a firefight. It had lost reaction time. The absence of counterfire was not an omission. It was the defining feature. The fleet had been neutralized before it could participate in its own defense. Only when losses were totaled did the scale become clear. 19 ships. 14 minutes. The numbers were understood before the reasons. At dawn, the Pacific revealed what the night had hidden. Debris drifted across calm water, oil spread in long, dark streaks, empty spaces marked where ships had sailed only hours earlier. The sea itself offered no explanation. The fleet had not been defeated in combat. It had been denied participation. Speed, precision, and tempo had removed the possibility of response. Firepower mattered less than timing. Courage mattered less than opportunity. Once reaction was suppressed, outcome followed automatically. This battle did not hinge on tactics in the traditional sense. It hinged on whether the fleet was allowed to fight at all. It was not. 19 ships were lost not because they were outgunned, but because the conditions required for defense never existed. The silence that followed the opening salvos was not empty, it was decisive. In modern naval warfare, the first moments are everything. Lose them, and nothing that follows can compensate. The Japanese naval force did not lose a battle. It lost the chance to have one. And in 14 minutes, that absence became permanent.